Wayne Williams is an assistant professor in the Design Studies program at Macewan University, where he has taught a wide variety of visual communication courses over the past 12 years. His primary teaching responsibilities have focused on the history of design and typography. Wayne's research interests include the history of design and material culture, visual communication, design and cognition, data visualization, and design pedagogy. Wayne holds a Bachelor of Design degree and a Master of Communications and Technology, and is currently pursuing a doctorate in the area of design and material culture at the University of Alberta. He is a member of the International Advisory Program Committee for Digital Research in the Humanities and Arts, and lectures frequently on a variety of design subjects. We're very pleased that Wayne has accepted our invitation to explain what he sees as the efficacy of these particular posters from a design point of view, the principles being employed in these works of art, and how design can influence action. In essence, an evaluation of the visual activism in action and why it can motivate. Please welcome Wayne Williams.
When I was asked to do this, initially, sort of literally within moments of saying yes, I started thinking to myself, do I really want to do this? Given the nature of what's actually going on, and trying to wrap my head around this from a perspective of being a design historian and looking at history. When I look at history or discuss history or teach history, I'm talking about typically things that historians agree on, right? We may differ on interpretation, but we tend to not differ too much on the facts. And I think one of the things that makes this particularly challenging is that we still don't know a lot of facts. This is a very, very fluid situation. So it was with that sort of initial reticence that I started to investigate and learn more about this. So just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from in relationship to this, as I said, I am a design historian. I've been teaching design history at Grant MacEwan for the past 13 years or so. I also teach graphic design studio courses, so I'm looking at these both in terms of history and how history may have informed them and how they may ultimately inform the history as it's happening, but also from the perspective of a graphic design instructor and how they're functioning in terms of the use of image, typography, visual rhetoric, and those are the things that I will talk mostly about. And the third point, I'm not Ukrainian. So one of the decisions that I made was to not get these posters translated initially, and just to look at them in as much as possible from a universal perspective and see what I could glean from them without actually understanding what the text said specifically. So what I wanted to talk about was the use of rhetoric, and when we talk about visual communication design, or any type of, but in this case these posters, we talk about the use of images and symbols as a form of argument. And we talk about the arrangement of the elements in terms of Gestalt theory in order to create a strong visual impact, the use of typography, type selection, hierarchies, things of that nature, and then the analyzing existing images and visuals and looking at those in terms of historical context or other references. So one of the things that I've sort of broken the posters into a few types or a few categories, and I wanted to talk about them in relationship to effective visual communication design and visual rhetoric. And one of the things that I was quite surprised by was the level of sophistication that I saw when I was looking at these posters. And sort of following on what Colin was saying, talking about the global village, this technical world that we live in now, the ubiquitous nature of technology is making everyone a content creator, a publisher. And it's clear by looking at this that the level of visual acuity and sophistication in young people today is really quite amazing. Because I have to tell you that, if I had a classroom of 50 students and they hung this up on a wall for a critique, I would be pretty impressed. So one of the things that I talk a lot about when I teach graphic design is the idea of there's a famous saying in modernism design, you may have heard it before, less is more. A famous typographer from the 1950s named Joseph Mueller Brockman would often say, I know a design is done when I can't take anything else away. The idea is reduce it to its essence. Get rid of the things that don't need to be there. Boil it down to its most powerful possible meaning or distillation. So some of these as examples of calls to action are fairly obvious. Some of the interesting things about this idea of a reductive approach to graphic design or visual communication design, when you look at these posters, you'll see that there's a very, very conscious effort to minimize things like color, controlling a color palette, controlling type, getting rid of multiple images and focusing on a single image, or creating an image, a complex image out of a combination of one or more images. And so you look at something like this, there are a number of interesting ways that it can be read. I have never been to Kiev, but I've been told that this is the founders' monument in Kiev. So by combining or mixing that symbol of the founders' monument with the flags and the trident, which is the symbol, the coat of arms for the Ukraine, you get this very, very powerful but very emotive image as well. And it conjures up a number of things. A friend of mine mentioned to me the other day, he thought it conjured up for him the American troops on Iwo Jima raising the flag. A couple of my students that I had shown some of these to said that it reminded them of early Russian and Chinese propaganda, the idea of the people marching in the streets with the flag, which is a fairly universal symbol, and we see it repeated in a number of ways in this exhibit. Again, this idea of boiling things down to their essence, the less is more. You know, here the call to action is clear. Come to Maidan. Or in this case, I don't have the translation with me now. It's over there. You are missing here, everyone to Maidan. So it's a very powerful, but again, very simple, reductive use of visual language to get that message across. So it's making sense both in terms of the text and the image and how they're working together. I thought this one was quite interesting. One of the courses that I'm taking right now, we had a discussion a couple of weeks ago. One of the grad students is from the Ukraine, and she was talking about, forgive me, I can't remember the name of it, but the scars, the traditional, can anyone help me? The textiles that you hang on icons or are part of weddings, and the symbolism that she talked a lot about the use of symbolism and iconography in the context of that. So even in something like this, there's a very deliberate choice to use the specific images or icons that are in there. Those birds, those flowers are all symbolic of hope, of freedom, of prosperity. This is revolution, Ukrainian revolution. The interesting thing about this, and I'll talk a little bit more about appropriation later on, but again, a very, very universal symbol, very, very easy to understand, and something that's shown up in a number of contexts throughout history, throughout the 20th century, as a powerful metaphor for a number of revolutions or social movements. This, of all of them, is probably the most reductive, I think. It's the only one, I think, that has no text whatsoever. The other thing that's really interesting about this, it may seem counterintuitive, but the idea of approaching design from this perspective of less is more, reducing things down to their essence, the meanings become, in some cases, less and less literal and much more open to interpretation. So we could literally read this as, we're going to tear down this statue of Lenin, but we could also read this more broadly as we're breaking ties to the past. We're breaking off something There's a broader interpretation possible there, but it's a very, very powerful image. I found this one particularly interesting in just how understated it is and how millennial, I guess, it is. This idea of it's not calling for revolution, it's just simply saying it's time for a change. Let's refresh this, let's change this, right? So it would resonate with a different age group in a different way than perhaps the previous image might. Colin talked a little bit about the use of humor and humor in satire. One of the other things that I thought was quite interesting about these posters was not just the use of humor, but the ones that can be seen as having a negative commentary are not demonizing the enemy in the way that we often see when we look at propaganda around revolution or social change. They're making fun of things, they're parodying them. So they're not inciting violent thoughts, they're inciting positive thoughts through the use of humor or irony. This is something that is not new to revolutions or social movements. The image on the left is a poster from the Solidarity movement with this sort of iconic image of a sheriff, and the idea being that there's a new sheriff in town and his name is Solidarity. This one is fairly obvious what's going on here. Again, the use of humor. Stop filling our heads with you know what. I thought this one was very, very clever, the play on words and the visual metaphor, right? It's a call for help. But again, it's using humor as a way of grabbing someone's attention, which is another aspect of using humor or irony in rhetoric, is that it makes the message resonate. It's something you don't forget. If you laugh about it, it's something you'll remember, right? In the same context, or the same way that, if you think about the best ad you've seen lately, it's the one that made you feel smart, or it's the one that made you laugh, and you think, gosh, that's clever. I really like that company. So as I said, the thinking about tone in relationship to this exhibit, I tried to find all of the ones that I thought had a slightly negative tone to them, and look at those and others and think about the use of symbols and this notion of appropriation, specifically in terms of audience. Because one of the things, and again, Colin sort of alluded to this, is that it's interesting how this is not just about what's taking place in Kiev. It's not just about the Ukraine. It's not just to the audience, the local audience there. This is very much to a global audience. So a lot of what's being used here in terms of symbols and appropriation are quite broad, but some of them are also quite narrow, and there's an interesting range of those things. So the idea of appropriation is taking something out of a context, putting it in a new context in order to, again, create a message. So in this case, we have the statue of Justice holding the baton and the handcuffs and the text, "Shame on the whole world." So again, making the message global and mixing the idea of the brute force of the establishment against this notion of justice for all in a global context. You can't have a revolution without Che. And I saw this and I thought, the text on this one is, "Hooray, glory to Ukraine." So I find this one particularly interesting because it's sort of, you have to wonder if the person who created this poster really knows that much about Che Guevara. But he's become such an icon, right? He's literally a logo for revolution. So we'll just put him in there and put the Ukrainian trident on his hat, and it'll all make sense. And to 19, 20-year-olds, it works. But to some, it might be actually offensive. The use of the raised fist, of course, as I said earlier, you can find that in virtually every social, political movement throughout the 20th century. This one, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but this is, the image on the right is the image that the one on the left is based on. So basically parodying this idea of, sorry, what's the designer's name? Shepard Fairey, the same graphic designer that did the Obama Hope poster. So this is a piece that he did when he was studying design at the Rhode Island School or Institute of Design in 1989. And it went globally viral. And you may have seen it traveling around the world. It's literally spray painted and stenciled on buildings all over the world. It's a representation of Andre the Giant, famous wrestler from the 1980s. So here the idea is to take that and the viral nature of it and appropriate that to get this message out and play off this idea of, you know, obey the dictator or not. I thought this was a really interesting one because this image, the poster on the left is using this photograph on the right, which was taken in November. So this is an image that became very popular and went viral in social media. It was from a protest in Italy around the middle of November of last year. So this is how quickly these images can go viral and become iconic and, you know, start showing up in these different contexts all over the place. The poster on the left, Solidarity, I found this interesting, is that I may be reading into this, but the way that the typography is handled on the poster on the left, by condensing the type together in this sort of claustrophobic way, might actually be a reference to the Solidarity logo, which was a play on the idea, again, of the crowd marching with the flag, but it also has some a sort of graffiti-esque feel to it as well, which is another element that shows up in some of these. And then again, another sort of direct quotation of a poster from the Solidarity movement in the 1980s being repurposed today. So, as I said earlier, when I was looking through these, trying to find the negative, the images that do show the most sort of negative aspects to what is going on, again, I found interesting in that they're not heavy-handed, they're not demonizing as much as they are a warning or a fear, but they're not suggesting or promoting in any way violent behavior. As Colin mentioned the Christmas trees, I wasn't aware of the relevance of the Christmas tree. And again, this is an interesting example in that it's very hard. I mean, obviously there's a pool of blood under the tree, but we're not quite sure what those gestural images are in the background. You know, what are they evocative of? Just chaos, things, you know, sort of coming apart. A couple of people have mentioned to me that they see angels' wings in them, but we don't really know. So, just to sort of sum up, as I said, I guess the one thing that I found, I guess, most prevalent, or the thing that impressed me the most about this entire exhibition was just this theme of hope, and that it's being expressed in this very, very effective visual language by you know, young people who may or may not be studying design. I'm not sure. I guess this one, I'll close on this one again, this idea of sort of mixing metaphors or symbols. The translation on this one, Nick? Stay the course. So the idea, you know, clearly referencing the Ukrainian flag and the flag of the European Union, but by showing just half of the circle of stars, it suggests that something isn't finished, but it might also be evocative of a sunrise, of a new tomorrow. So there's a number of ways that it can be read, and it really is open to the audience, the individual, to interpret it. Thank you.